And we'll start with some introductions. Dr. Robbie, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, my name is Kari Robbie. I am a family practice and addiction medicine physician, and I work here at the Native American Community Clinic for the last 10 years, and I work a lot with our MAT program.
And Nikki?
I'm Nikki Jardina. I am the infectious disease nurse at NACC.
My name is Tina. I am the harm reduction manager.
And Michelle Corcoran, she's our MAT nurse manager. She was not able to join us either today. And then my name is Lindsay King-Cooney. I'm the Community and Tribal Engagement Specialist here at NACC. And I'll start with some announcements before we introduce our speaker for today. Okay, so welcome to Midwest Tribal Echo. Today we have Liz Velek talking to us about transactional sexual relationships, sex, work, money, and stigma. A little bit about our clinic. So NACC was established in 2003. We're a FQHC right in the heart of South Minneapolis urban indigenous community. We offer a variety of primary care services, dental services, and all kinds of wraparound services as well. This is just a list of our current positions that are open at NACC. So feel free, if you go to our website, nacc-healthcare.org, you can find out more about those jobs. Some session guidelines. Please note protected health information. If you could mute yourself. I think during this session, Liz has some questions that she may ask, so feel free to unmute yourself if you have any responses. Always welcome to eat your lunch. This is a casual atmosphere. If you could let me know in the chat who you are, so your name, title, organization, and email, that helps us a lot, especially sending out the post survey to you. And then we invite you to use the chat to ask questions at any time. And if you're comfortable with it, if you could turn your camera on, we'd love to see your faces. And then some announcements, our upcoming echoes. We have August 16th, Justin LeBeau talking to us about a Vivo Village and outreach. And then September 6th, Dr. Ntaba will be presenting on Beyond Bedside Manner. This is just a list of other echoes that we recommend that offer topics on OUD. And then we do offer community education credit for those who are eligible. We just ask that you fill out the survey that I will put into the chat today and then also email that out to you. And then just a reminder of the X waiver removal. So all practitioners who have a current DEA registration may now prescribe buprenorphine for OUD in their practice. And the CME credit from these echo sessions do count towards that. So just wanted to point that out. And then also at the bottom, there's a link to the training requirements. And then case presentations, if you have any to share, they make for great discussion. So please feel free to put something in the chat or you can email me. My email address is listed at the bottom there. And I think that's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand it over to Liz. Liz, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you to Lindsay and Javon for inviting me to speak today. I'm really happy to be here. So my name is Liz Velek. My pronouns are she and they. I have a master's of public health from the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality. I also have a sexual health education certification from the University of Minnesota. I currently work in Illinois at Maytech, although I'm not here representing Maytech today. I'm here as an independent. And I am formerly a resident of Minneapolis. I grew up in Minneapolis. I lived in Minneapolis for 38 years. It's been about 20 years since I left. So I'm really happy and excited to be here today, reconnecting with my hometown. And I left off. I also am a former sex worker. I have 20 years of experience doing sex work. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. And I really appreciate everyone's presence today. And It's going to be partially participatory, so I'll be asking you some questions. Feel free to take yourselves off mute and join in. And with that, I'm going to start my screen share. Let me switch it to presenter view. Great. Can everybody see? I actually, somehow in doing that, I lost you all. I'm going to escape. I can see the Zoom. I wonder how I keep the Zoom going where I can still see the tiles, but share. Go. All right, I'll try it one more time. It's possible I may be speaking to a blank screen. Ah, y'all are still at the top. That's good for now. Okay, again. Ooh, good. Y'all are still there.
That looks good.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Thank you. Are the images of the room on the top or no? Like, can you see the people?
I can see people on the side.
Okay.
No, we can't see. So you're just sharing your presentation, not your full screen.
No, exactly. Okay, good. I just want to make sure the tiles weren't interrupting the view.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
I
cool.
just want to say before we get started, if you're able and willing to turn on your camera, since it will be participatory, that would be awesome.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for bearing with me while I got up to speed technically. So with that, I would like to formally begin today's conversation regarding transactional sexual relationships. We're here to discuss sex, work, money, and stigma. So the goals of meeting today, I want to incite questions, I want to challenge ways of thinking, and I want to encourage the pursuit of knowledge. And when you leave here today, I'm hoping that you'll be able to define sex work. I'm hoping that sex work and sex workers will be demythologized for you. I'm hoping that you'll have a deeper understanding of the social, political, and economic context within which sex work or transactional sexual relationships occur. We would like to differentiate between sex work and sex trafficking, two very different things. And in the process of having these conversations, the end goal is to gain and develop skills for working more effectively with sex workers and sex worker populations. So, sex, work, and money, three taboo topics rolled into one, are the fundamental basis of sex work. And here we have a formal definition of transactional sex. Who would like to take themselves off mute and read this definition for us? Don't be shy. I'm not going to just stand here and talk to y'all all day. I want you to participate.
I can go ahead and read it for you.
Thank
you. It's the exchange of money or goods for sexual services, either regularly or occasionally, involving male, female, or transgender adults, young people, and children, where the sex worker may or may not consciously define such activity as income generating.
Thank you, Javon. And this definition comes from the United Nations AIDS Interagency Task Team on Gender and HIV/AIDS. So I put this up front so that we have kind of a ground basis so that we know what we're all talking about today. Now, when we talk about transactional sex and sex workers, we also want to be mindful of the language that we use. So what are some terms that we've heard for sex work and sex workers? Feel free to yell them out. You won't get in trouble if you say a stigmatizing word. Prostitute, hooker, whore, hoe, those are all terms generally considered stigmatizing. Non-stigmatizing words are sex worker and transactional sex. You'll hear me throughout the course of our conversation today using sex worker and transactional sex rather interchangeably. If you do hear me use the word prostitution, it is only in reference to legal statutes. Generally, that is considered a stigmatizing word. But I would also like to make a point about terms and words in general, we all know that the meaning varies depending on who the speaker is, what the context is, and also what the intention is. So there's, of course, as with all marginalized populations, sometimes people reclaim stigmatizing words. So if a sex worker refers to themselves with any of the words on the left-hand column, that's their prerogative. But as healthcare workers delivering services, I encourage you to remain with the words on the right-hand column, the non-stigmatizing words. So what are some of the ways that sex work can occur? Well, there's a very wide range and broad variety of services that encompass sex work. It can be anything from a webcam where there's no direct person-to-person contact, to a dungeon where people engage in bondage, discipline, and sadomasochistic activities, consensually, of course. Escorts, people that can go out on dates with you, exotic dancing, erotic massage, phone sex operator, and then survival sex. Who would like to take themselves off mute and describe for us what they think survival sex is referring to?
Survival sex is when people have sex in exchange for things that they need just to get by day to day. So like some place to stay or food or resources.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't see who said that, but thank you to whoever said that. Exactly. So thinking back to the definition stated at the beginning, transactional sex relates to the exchange of sex or sexual services for either money or also for goods or, a place to stay, medication, day-to-day needs of daily living. So now that we've kind of formed a little bit of a basis around what we're talking about, let's look at breaking down the components that comprise sex work. Let's start out by talking about work. And I would like you all to consider, what is the nature of labor under capitalism? Hopefully everybody had a chance to read the pre-assessment survey. I don't expect you to share anything. That was just for your own personal edification to kind of get the wheels turning in your brain about what is our current economic status in our country. So when we look at our current economic status, we see that the cost of living has actually increased 500% from 1973 until now. The average hourly wage, however, has only increased a mere 10%. Simultaneous to this, the gross domestic product, or how much work is being produced and goods and services are being produced for this mere 10% increase in wages, has increased 75%. So people are expected to do 75% more labor for only a 10% increase in pay, and they're expected to pay 500 times the amount of what they were paying before for things like housing, healthcare, food, electricity. Meanwhile, the average CEO salary has increased 997% from the end of the 70s until now, putting their salaries around 300 times what the average worker earns. So we can see that there has been a progressive and rapid systemic redistribution of the wealth. Again, creating a greater divide between, the 1% and the rest of us. And these statistics come from the American Institute for Economic Research and the Economic Policy Institute. So increasingly inaccessible to larger and larger groups of people have become things like the cost of education, securing a student loan, access to healthcare, quality healthcare, housing, and of course, worker rights. So we're witnessing shrinking access to all of these things, where more and more people are experiencing limited access to the basic needs of daily living. Many workers, particularly those who work in alternative economies, are without proper or any rights. So again, let's carry on with our considering of work in a capitalistic economy, and how we conceptualize work. So why do we esteem some forms of work and not others? And when I say esteem, How do we as a culture and as a society demonstrate that these pictured roles here are esteemed? What do you guys think? Talk to me.
They all seem to be an authority.
Yes, social and political power associated with the roles. Thank you. What else?
A lot of those are high-paying positions.
But how much they pay, exactly. What else?
They tend to be held by Caucasian folks.
By who has access to them? Thank you. Exactly. So we've created a hierarchy, essentially. And simultaneous to this, we scoff at other forms of labor. And when I say scoff, how do we demonstrate that we're scoffing at these jobs and subsequently the people who perform them?
I think sometimes people feel like people that do other types of jobs might not be as smart or like educated, or come from a different, like lower background.
Thank you. Again, stigma and lack of social and political power, unreasonably long hours, how little these jobs pay, and ultimately, in the most extreme cases, by criminalizing some of these jobs and also the people who perform the labor involved in these jobs. And who typically gets relegated to these roles pictured here?
The most vulnerable populations.
Thank you, exactly. And by most vulnerable, we mean BIPOC, Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, queer, LGBTQ plus people, women, and undocumented workers. Great Father Karl Marx said prostitution is only a specific expression of the general prostitution of the laborer. So basically, what I've been saying in this section is that when we look at our hierarchy of work roles in our current society, we see that our embodiment, who we are physically, is tied closely to our worth, which has a great power to determine what work is available to us, and subsequently how we are paid, or in extreme cases, we might be criminalized for trying to do that work. So what's the number one reason that people go to work in the first place? Why does everybody go to work?
Money.
Money. Thank you, Javon. Yeah. Money. Because we need money. We need money to pay our bills. We need money to pay our rent. We need money to eat and to survive. That is why people work. And who gets access to money and who is strategically blocked from it. So what I'm trying to get you to think about is and look at are the connections between identity, work opportunities, and criminalization. And who might have difficulty accessing opportunities of reasonable labor. Who do you guys think? Talk to me.
Somebody with a criminal record.
Excellent, thank you. Justice-involved persons. Persons with mental health issues that limit their ability to participate in the compulsory 40 plus hours a week that our capitalist economy enforces upon us. BIPOC persons, LGBTQ plus persons, women, differently abled persons, disabled persons. So we know that there is a lot of discrimination in the workforce. Statistics bear out that African Americans, queer people, BIPOC persons are discriminated against when seeking employment, discriminated against on the job, and often end up experiencing harassment and leaving jobs. Particularly at risk are persons with intersectional identities, We know that Black and brown trans women experience the highest rates of violence in our society and also the highest rates of discrimination when seeking employment and housing. So what happens when people cannot successfully secure the economic means to pay for day-to-day living? When they're left out of the mainstream economy, but they need to survive, how are people going to get their needs met? Through the emergence of alternative economies. So alternative economies emerge in response to the structural barriers to work. And what I really want you to recognize is that all alternative economies have parallel forms in the mainstream economy. And what defines some work as illegal is not the what, but the who. I'm going to give you an example. So there was something called the Barcero contract, which the United States government had with Mexico between 1945 and 1964. And during this time, the US was importing, trafficking, moving brown people across our border to pick fruits and vegetables. Now, they weren't giving the workers proper pay. They didn't have proper housing. They didn't have proper sanitation in the housing. And when the workers spoke up and, asked for their rights, the United States government said, all right, you know what? We're going to just tear up this contract and now you're illegal. We'll still traffic you. You'll still come here to work to pick our fruits and vegetables, but good luck asking for your rights now because now your labor is criminalized. So I'm using this as an example because I want you to see how whimsical the definition is. And I also want you to see how the mainstream structure benefits off the labor of these marginalized populations. And I think there was one other thing I was thinking about too, but it's gone right now. So here's some examples. If you study the drug laws in our country, you'll see that racial profiling is at the root of each law, and that the drugs of choice of the current outgroup would be criminalized as a way of policing identity. So Big Farm is free to do what it wants. A young Black man selling a plant standing on a corner will be arrested. What about numbers, running numbers and things? We've got Wall Street, totally considered respectable, but bookies and persons running parallel economies on the street level are criminalized. What about sex? Sex is the #1 thing used to sell products in the United States. But if a woman, man, or trans person chooses to harness the labor of their own sexuality, they will be criminalized for it. And this is probably my favorite one because it's so obvious. It's like, it's the exact same picture. What about Gucci handbags, for example? I don't know, I lived in New York. In New York City, in Chinatown, there was a huge area where people manufactured replicas because they didn't have the access to the patenting rights, et cetera. So one person can sell a handbag and it's legal. Another person can sell a bag and be arrested for it, even though it's the exact same handbag. What about political organizing? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about what some of the policing of that has looked like in a few moments. And at the end, I really just want to sum up from this section that, again, when we conceptualize what is legal labor and what is non-legal or criminal labor, if we look with open eyes and an open mind, we can clearly see that it isn't the what, but it is the who. Most of our laws criminalizing alternative economies are geared towards policing various populations, keeping them marginalized, and keeping the mainstream economy inaccessible to them. So let's unpack some of the stigma around sexuality. Before I move into this section, I want to just check in and see how's everybody doing, questions, comments, concerns. I'm going to look in the chat. All right, well, hearing silence, I'm going to keep it rolling. So here's a definition of sexuality that comes from the World Health Organization. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I'm going to highlight the words that are highlighted. We see that our sexuality is complex and multidimensional, and it encompasses our gender identities, our sexual orientation, pleasure, intimacy, and reproduction. And it's something that we experience. And all of these dimensions are influenced by a wide variety of biological, psychological, and social factors. Sexuality occurs at the intersection of these factors, the intersection of our embodiment, of our experiences and our desires, and also of our socially constructed identities. Sexuality is powerful. Sex is tied to our most primal fears relating to life, birth, and death. Where were we before we were born, and where are we going after we leave here? It's connected to our interrelationships with other people. It addresses questions like, are we alone or are we together? We can commune through sex. We literally merge with another person. And we all came into this world through the doorway of sex. Sex gave the conception of life. And again, it taps into where were we before we came here, which is intimately connected to the same question of where do we go when we leave here. So sex is part of our cycle of birth and death. So it's a heavy topic. And it's no surprise that we live in a society that has a lot of stigma attached to it. Specifically, there's something called sexual behavior stigma. And this definition is defined as stigma that is anticipated, perceived, or experienced as a result of one's sexual practices. And we live in a society that has strict and harsh double standards about whose sexuality is privileged and whose isn't. In our society, if you have the right identity variables, AKA rich, straight, white man, you can perpetrate things like rape and still be assigned to the highest offices in our country. But if you are an individual struggling to pay your rent and you choose to harness the labor of your sexuality to get those needs met, you could end up in jail. So the history of the suppression of sexuality is very long and very deep, and it's tied to the suppression of the divine feminine and queer and trans spirits. So in 4000 BC, in the area that we now call Germany, Indo-Germanic people moved into the region. The people who were living there were indigenous, Black and brown populations. They were polytheistic. They worshiped multiple gods and goddesses. The divine mother was at the core of their worship. And their priests and priestesses were primarily LGBTQ plus persons, primarily trans persons, actually. And so these white people moving into the area were like, I want control of that land. I want to harness the fruits of the land itself. I want to harness the labor of the people working the land. And I'm going to accomplish this by subjugating them, by demonizing their religions, by demonizing their identities, demonizing them for being Black and brown, demonizing them for being queer spirits, demonizing them for worshiping the divine mother, and in turn, demonizing the feminine energies. So they were a monotheistic people. They worshiped one God and a male God, and they successfully subjugated the people of that land by enforcing their religion over them. In 600 BC, East Roman Emperor Justinian declared himself the enemy of unmanly lust, read homosexuality, and he actually codified it into law. And incidentally, his legal system still forms the basis of our legal system here in the United States. So we see that there is a long history of a relationship between religion and law, and how it regulates, surveys, suppresses the sexuality of certain groups in order to control those groups, and actually also ultimately in the examples I just gave, to control the labor of those groups. So I'm not going to fully unpack the slide because this is a really intense slide. It could be a lecture all in and of itself. Let me just make sure that I move this bar, because I'm not sure. My view is obstructed up there. There we go. So tools of colonization actually have been employed and deployed upon a variety of populations across time and space. I just talked to you about 4000 BC and 600 BC. I'm not going to unpack the other half of the slide really, but if we look at the informal methods of control, things like media, hate speech, and gossip is one way that we enforce stigma upon various groups. And then we also have formal aspects of social control, things like the AMA and the APA and the law, systems by which we define people as, mentally unhealthy, physically unhealthy, criminals and deviants, and enforce control over those populations. In more recent times in the United States, sexuality got tied to criminality through a series of programs instituted by J. Edgar Hoover, starting in the 30s is when the United States first started to criminalize homosexuality. But J. Edgar Hoover came in the 50s through the 70s with a variety of programs, including COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, where he surveyed political organizing of the Black Panther Party, the Gay Liberation Front. He successfully infiltrated those organizations and broke up the alliance between the groups and broke up the groups from within. And again, this was a way of decentralizing power, of ensuring that the groups involved in the organizing had no social or political power, and a way of criminalizing and controlling who has access to what aspects of the economy. Hoover also gave us the concept of the progressive criminal, which states that if somebody, so he defined homosexuality, sex work, political organizing as criminal, and also stated if somebody commits one crime, they're guilty of all crimes. So if someone's a sex worker, that obviously means they're also a rapist or a pedophile or so on and so forth. And he actually succeeded in getting Homeland Security tied in to being one of his agents of surveillance and social control. Ooh, my slide is not clicking forward. There we go. So throughout time, there have been a wide variety of laws that come and go that police sex workers and people involved in sex work. And it's no surprise that these laws have been able to take a foothold based on the history that I just gave you of how throughout time and space, and also specifically in our country, sexuality has been framed, stigmatized, demonized, criminalized, and policed. So I'm not going to break down each and every single one of these, but suffice it to say that what often happens is that a law will pop up. If there's a protest against it, it will just get renamed and changed and still be in existence. So like stop and frisk, for example, I have big beef with that one because that was in effect when I was living in New York. I was stopped and frisked on the regular. It's a law that is intentionally, all of these are vaguely written, and that is with intent so that they can be used to target various populations, BIPOC persons, women, trans and queer spirits. I see a couple things in the chat. I'm going to just look. Okay. How's everyone doing? Questions, comments, concerns? Hearing none, I'm going to continue forward. Okay, there we go. So let's talk about the spectrum of agency involved in sex work or transactional sex. Who participates in transactional sex and why? So the spectrum of agency is a bell curve, like all things. On the one end, we have informed consent or choice, where somebody actually has an array of options around what type of work they can be involved in, but they choose sex work because that's their preference. Again, I want to remind you, this is a bell curve. This is a very small group of people that we're talking about there. If you look at the slide, you'll see that I wrote the glorification under choice. And I wrote that because based on media representations, the media tends to represent transactional sex and transactional sex workers and sex workers in general in a very polarized lens. We've got, on the one hand, the glorification, ridiculous images like Pretty Woman, where somebody's having a ball and they're just involved in sex work because they're so hot and this is wonderful for them. It's what I call the glorification. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the media serves us images, what I call the glorification. People who are participating in sex work because of coercion. They're there through force, fraud, or they've entered into this form of labor because somebody has tricked them or convinced them somehow to participate. This also includes anyone who is unable to consent. I am not suggesting that that's an okay method to be routed into sex work, but I'm acknowledging that when the media uses images of people who are beat down and helpless and so on like this, it's doing it with the intent of riling political support for further criminalization. And criminalizing sex work does not actually reduce sex trafficking, it actually increases sex trafficking. I would also like to note on this slide that the majority, so when we think of trafficking, who do we think of as being trafficked and why? Please take yourself off mute and speak.
I feel a lot of press talks about, at least right-wing press focuses on children and Democrats.
Yeah, thank you. Right, children and women and people from other countries, and it's framed as people without any agency. So the truth is, 3/4 of all trafficked labor is trafficked for things other than sex work. At the same time, there's an inverse relationship between the amount of money garnered off of global trafficking for sex work versus the other forms of work. So the other forms of work that people are trafficked for relate to things like migrant workers to pick vegetables, nannies, domestic care, mining and manufacturing. Nobody cares about that. You don't see any images in the media of, oh my gosh, these helpless beat down miners. We've got to enact a bunch of laws to criminalize them. And again, I never finished what I was saying about the numbers of the money. Like $150 billion are netted annually globally from all trafficked labor, but 99 billion of those through sex work. And the other 50 through the other forms of labor. So there's a political motivation to control, that's all undocumented money, AKA untaxed. Also, you heard me mention borders and Black and brown bodies crossing borders. So the real political interest in criminalizing sex work and in making sex workers the face of trafficking is because the powers that be want to control borders, they want to control bodies moving across borders, and they want to have access to taxing that money. So the majority of people, so this is only a very small percentage of persons who are actually involved in sex. And I also want to kind of really radicalize your mind here. So I mentioned before that I lived in New York. I worked in sex work in New York. I worked with persons from all over the world. The majority of them were living temporarily in the United States, making money, doing sex work, sending the money back to their home country because why? The dollar has a huge value over there. They would come here, work for like 4 years, buy a home for their family, go back, and then retire. That sounds great. I'm like, hook me up. So the interest in policing these borders, so many of these people had come there, quote unquote, fitting the definition of trafficking, but they were not forced by anyone. Maybe some of them did actually pay a fee to someone to help them get in the country, but how is that different than how we pay somebody a headhunter to search work for us? So I'm encouraging you to question the structure and to look more deeply at the stories that we have been fed. And again, I want to emphasize that the glorification and the glorification, people working in sex work because they think it's fun, or people working there because they were forced, are the very small ends of that spectrum of agency. The majority of people participating in sex work are there because of circumstances, or what we call bound agency, economic pressures, and reduced choices. So let's take a look at what some of those reduced choices might be. What are some factors that might limit people's options of work? Tell me.
A person may feel underpaid at their 9 to 5 that they work, so they may do it as an alternative just to make some money on the side.
Thank you, Javon. Exactly. Sometimes it can be to fill in the gaps. Yep. Like I'm working this full-time job, but I still can't afford rent. We know that in the United States right now, the average 1-bedroom apartment costs about $1,500 to $1,800 a month. For a person working a minimum wage job, they would need to work 2.5 full-time jobs in order to just be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. Sex work gives people an economic way to make a lot of money in a short period of time. Other things could be immigration status. If you are undocumented and without papers, you don't have the same access to mainstream economy. If your justice involved, somebody mentioned earlier, if you're living with a disability and you're on disability, that money is not going to be really enough to support a life. But if you take a part-time job that's documented, you may jeopardize your benefits. So sex work can be a viable way of generating extra funds to support the daily costs of life. So also people who are in competing roles. What if you're a student and a parent and working? How are you going to have enough hours in the day to do all of that? Well, sex work is a very viable option. What questions, comments, concerns does anybody have?
Just thinking also about chemical health issues, how that can limit your work options.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate whoever said that. I couldn't see you, but yes, drug addiction. And we're going to actually look a little bit more at that in the next section. And also mental health issues and also physical health issues. I actually live with autoimmune disease. It was very difficult for me to work the expected 60 hours of my job. And physically, I wasn't capable of doing it. Sex work gives you that flexibility. What if I have an autoimmune flare and I can't work for 3-4 weeks? Well, most jobs are not going to be like, oh, that's cool. Just get back to us when you feel well again. Sex work allows people flexibility over their hours, also less tensions with different coworkers and things like that. You can work for yourself. Also, a lot of people enter into sex work at the time of a crisis in their life, leaving maybe a domestically violent relationship or in a transition period, moving to a new city and not being grounded yet. So there are a lot of different reasons why people's options are limited and why sex work is a viable source of income for many people. And I also want to stress that sex work and sex trafficking are not the same thing. And Again, just to reemphasize that the two are often intentionally conflated to stoke the fires of moral indignation, sex panic, and thus criminalization to control all of those who are already left outside of the framework of the mainstream economy. Sex work is consensual, and sex trafficking is non-consensual. And again, involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion, or affects somebody who is unable to consent, or legally is defined as somebody who has moved across a state line, although again, that can be a conflation. And also, of course, persons under the age of 18. I didn't put that on the slide. And again, I want to underscore that I am not endorsing trafficking, merely asking you to analyze it in a little bit more depth. And also to recognize that sex work is something completely separate from sex trafficking. I'm going to make another point about sex trafficking on this slide too, and show you kind of how the law gets involved in inappropriate ways. So here's an example. Let's say that I have an apartment here in Chicago, and let's say I do sex work out of this apartment. Now, let's say a friend of mine comes from New York to visit for the weekend, and they're also a sex worker. And I say, oh yeah, you can see some clients in my space, that's fine. Technically, under the law, I have now trafficked that person, and I am also a pimp. When in reality, both people in the imagined scenario I just gave were consensually working, trying to get money, trying to make their ends meet. All right, let's keep it rolling. And let's talk a little bit about trauma, stigma, and violence, and the relationship between the whole. I was actually thinking about this slide, like, you know how in the middle of the night you kind of wake up and are thinking about stuff. I was like, I should have put more arrows. I should have put a million arrows going from and to everything, because criminalization in and of itself, well, first of all, let me back up and let me say that. So who have I been saying so far participates in sex work? If you had to summarize it for me, what populations participate in sex work? Somebody please tell me.
It wouldn't just be the human race.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Thank you, Anthony. I saw your name.
Well, I just think that it's like we have this idea and this narrative of like who does sex work, you know, and you know it's largely informed by media and television and all this other stuff that's not even really like as a sliver of reality, if that.
Thank you for that perspective. I greatly appreciate that. Yes, the human race, and also a subset of the human race that has been strategically blocked from accessing the mainstream economy, which includes marginalized populations, BIPOC people, LGBTQ plus people, women.
Poor people.
Yes, poor people, persons with mental health issues, persons with physical health issues. So what we know about all of those populations is that ACEs are high. Who wants to tell me what ACEs are? Has anybody heard of ACEs before?
Adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you. Adverse childhood experiences, because we know that systems and individuals discriminate against those populations and perpetrate violence against those populations. So it's highly likely that persons participating in sex work have encountered trauma in their history. Now, I don't want to falsely draw a link between, oh, you're traumatized, therefore you're a sex worker, but I'm wanting to open your mind that systemically, violence has been historically perpetrated against various populations, and that there's trauma associated with that. So, as if that's not bad enough, sex workers, we know sex workers also have to deal with criminalization, which is its own form of trauma. And we know that there is a link between trauma and addiction. I encourage you to check out Dr. Gabor Mate's work. The Myth of Normal is a great book that breaks down all of the physiological and psychological effects of trauma on a person's body. Just like the ACEs, studies showed us how poor health outcomes are the result of trauma. addiction is the result of trauma. And then, like I was saying, as if that's not bad enough, you pile criminalization on top of that, which has an intimate relationship to stigma. Criminalization enforces stigma, stigma informs criminalization. The two things go back and forth. And it's not unlikely that sex workers are going to encounter violence by the system and also by people like their partners. If they out themselves as I'm a sex worker, their partner may become violent towards them, may try to exploit them. Again, because of criminalization, a lot of sex work happens under the auspices of other persons, like a manager or a pimp, as some may call, and that person may also exploit that worker. So now picture being in the situation where maybe you have a life history of trauma because of variables of your identity. You do not have enough money. You are engaging in transactional sex because you need to stay housed. You may be dealing with some addiction issues, and now you have to look over your shoulder at every moment for the law. And now you come in and you try to access services somewhere and you encounter stigma from a worker at a health clinic or a mental health clinic or somewhere where you're trying to access some form of social services. So it is our duty and our job as people working in this field to unpack that stigma and to remove ourselves from being one more variable that participates in stigmatizing and traumatizing the individuals and populations who are engaging in transactional sex. So, we're getting close on time. Okay, so where do we go from here? Let's raise our cultural competence. What can non-sex workers do? You can be aware of the stigma. You can honor sex worker agency. And what I mean by that is don't assume the end goal is that exit is the end goal for anyone. You can attend sensitivity trainings, facilitate access to care, engage yourself in social and political advocacy, and employ harm reduction tactics when working with sex workers. Do follow the lead on terminology, as in when you're listening to somebody speak about their sex work, tend to follow their lead. However, again, if a word feels stigmatizing or unnatural, please refrain from using it. Respect the boundaries of the individuals that you encounter who engage in this format of work, and recognize that we are all complex individuals, so much more than the sum of just our labor. Do not out people, do not fetishize or use workers for cool points. And don't assume anything about workers. Don't assume their sexual orientation, their identity, their relationship model, or anything about their mental, physical, or sexual health. And on the agency-wide level, please try to involve your agency with partnering with community organizations that centralize sex worker populations. Work to foster equitable and mutually beneficial relationships with those agencies, and recognize your role as a gatekeeper. And 3 final thoughts: just say no to jailing nonviolent offenders. Here it says for marijuana, but I would also add for sex work, so that private prisons can make money. Also, please always question authority, and ultimately think it ain't illegal yet. They have not yet outlawed thinking. So please think. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I would like to open it up for questions.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz.
You're welcome, Lindsay. Thank you.
Does anybody have any final questions or comments?
Was there anything that's unclear, or was there anything that you're like, why did you talk about that?
No, I think you could do a whole sort of like, 4 or 5 hour long conversation about this though, easily. So there's a lot to still unpack, but you gave us a really good foundation. So I apologize for being late too. I was a little late, but I'll go back and watch the tape. So
no worries.
The tape, I just dated myself. I could just put myself squarely in the 80s there. the word tape.
I'm still there with you, Anthony. Why leave the 80s? We thought it was bad then, little did we know.
Yeah. Madonna and big hair, what it wasn't to love about the 80s.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I agree, it could be like a 5 hour, just that one slide even that I put up. I'm like, I could talk about this slide for hours, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much, like I'm not boned up on the, on the research around sex work and human trafficking, but for many folks, I think there's a real clear trajectory, like on a pathway that sort of kind of, that is very, worn and really clear. That and I think, the community we serve, there's a really strong correlation between, trauma and victimization and the lack of opportunity, right? Like if you can't get a job and you can't pay your rent and you can't do a few other things, but you have these other abilities, right? It's a clear pathway there. So unfortunately, it leads to some really poor health outcomes and stuff. So
yes, thank you for underscoring that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing that I was going to say when we were talking about that slide and you were talking about stigma, is that there's this prevailing narrative, I think, in society that there's also a level of unintelligence that goes with being a sex worker. Like you don't it's not about we place the problem inside the individual, they're poor, but they're also incapable, they don't have skills, they don't have so that there's this other challenge that we have to sort of unpack, which is maybe for some people it was the logical and intelligent choice.
Yeah.
So.
And the path of least harm. Thank you, Anthony. Exactly. Yeah. And I like what you said about the lens, because it's right, we tend to, as a society, put this lens on the sex worker, what's wrong with you? But we don't flip the lens and look at what's wrong with the society where an average 1-bedroom apartment costs $1,500. Well, yeah. You have to work 2.5 minimum wage jobs to pay for that. What's wrong with the society where the scale of income, wealth inequity has flipped the way that I was demonstrating on that one slide? It's there's structural, systemic levels of things that create the situation, not a case of moral corruption.
And I think that's the biggest challenge, is those structural things are invisible, unless we work hard to make them more visible and bring them to the forefront. It's really problematic in a lot of ways, but anyway, so I could talk about this all day too myself.
I love it. I love your input. Thank you. What else?
All right, I think we should probably wrap up, unfortunately, but I just thank you so much, Liz, for your excellent presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Next session will be in 2 weeks. It's on the 16th, and we'll be talking about Avivo Village and their outreach. So please come back and join.
Cool. Thank you again.
Have a great day.
Hey, Sarah, I see you. Y'all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a great presentation. We'll talk soon.
Great. Look forward to talking to all three of you soon.